It's going to include everything, certainly everything we've done up to last week, and then possibly including what we're including today. Actually, let's make it simpler. Let's make it include everything we've done up to last week. In other words, up to the physiocrats. And therefore, it's not going to cover the work from today on, Adam Smith and the rest of classical economics and what follows. And I will put something to the effect on the Sakai notice boards. Liesl, was that the right, is that the answer you were looking for? Was that your question? Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Anything else? Okay, last week, well, today our main focus will be Adam Smith. We'll discuss Adam Smith, aspects of Adam Smith today and next week's lecture, although next week's lecture will then also move on to David Ricardo and other aspects of classical economics. Last week we discussed the physiocrats, and there were some questions afterwards. I just want to address some of those questions. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to, has this setup changed or is it just me? Okay, I'm going to pull up our slide that we've used for the physiocrats. Wow, what was it? Okay, here we go. Can you all see that tableau économique, which we had discussed last week?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
And so just to refresh your memory, there was a net product produced of £2,000, which was reinvested into or the expenditure by the landowners. Half went to artisans or the sterile class, and half went to the farmers. Remember, which sector produces the surplus or the produit net?
The agricultural sector.
The agricultural sector. And what we were looking at, the policies was, their policies were let there be more support for the agricultural sector. And relating to the tax, a uniform tax, for instance. And so some of the questions were by the more numerically minded. So I just want to look at that same diagram, and I've put together a little table here. And as it stands, it presents the same information. But we are looking at what happens if more of the expenditure of landlords is made on farming output and less on the sterile class. And we're asking it not only with regard in order to understand better the tableau économique, but we're also asking about it because it's going to have implications later for the context when we discuss David Ricardo, for instance. Let me just ask a question on your side. When I'm talking like this, can you see me or do you only see the screen?
We also see you.
You also see me, okay. So let us say that we were to change, if of the 2000s, it's not 50, but 80% that is spent on the agricultural sector. And you would see that, and then of course, then if 80% is spent on the agricultural sector by the landlords, only 20% is spent on the sterile class. And what you will see is that after the goods and the money has circulated through the system, and remember, he had this image of a circulation, like the circulation of the blood in the human body, and likewise the circulation of money and goods through the economic system. Well, this initial distribution by the landlords, and often the landlords are called the distributive class in the physiocratic system, you would then get to a situation where the total expenditure on farming and farming output would be 3,400 and only 1,600 after circulation on a sterile class. But what is, and so as in the previous situation, let's just go back, whoops. We've had this figure here, total expenditure on farmers and the sterile class is 4,000 rands, this value here. And so what we see is that in the new, and let's call it equilibrium, we've got the same value here, except now more expenditure on the farmers and less on the sterile class. So if you like, total expenditure is the same, and there hasn't really been any growth in that first period. I call it an equilibrium, and in this equilibrium position, of course, the sterile class has had less income, and it's the farming sector that has benefited. Nonetheless, it's a new equilibrium. Why do I call it a new equilibrium? Because now the landlords have 2,399 rand available for distribution. Why do I say that they've got 2,399 rand or 2,400? That's what it should show. Why do I say that they've got 2,400 for distribution? What is the reasoning behind that? It's one of our assumptions. Do you recall which assumption is responsible for this?
It's because the agricultural sector is the only sector that's responsible for growth.
Okay, it's responsible for the net surplus.
Yes.
It's the only one that achieves a produit net or a surplus. But why do I say the surplus that's now going to be available to the landlords is 2,400? Why that figure in particular?
I think if you do the calculations and the 100% return of the output of the agricultural sector coming back as rent to the landlords will.
Thank you very much. That's good. That's the assumption of the 100% return. The farming sector, the agricultural sector, produces a surplus, a rate of return of 100%. So expenditure of 2,400, some of which is reinvested into the farming sector, will produce a surplus of 2,400. Now, so then we have 2,400 available to the landlords, given us rent to the landlords. And the outcome of that is that it now generates, even if we only assume, even if we go back to our initial assumption of distribution of 50 to 50. Okay, when we go back to our 50-50 distribution, we then get an equilibrium of the 2,400. But for as long as more gets spent on the agricultural sector and less on the sterile class, the more there will be growth in the economy. The surplus will now increase to 2,879, and the total expenditure on a sterile class and the agricultural sector will now be the 4,799 or 4,800 Rand here. And so the economy would have grown by the equivalent of 800 pounds.
Dr. Stetler?
Yes.
I'm not sure if it's only me, but all that I can see on my screen right now is the PowerPoint presentation that we were working with last week, which still seems to be in the original 50-50 split.
Okay, thank you very much, because it's meant to be something entirely different. Let me see how I do that. Okay, well then I apologize for this. You missed all the important stuff. So I've got to, let me try that again. Can you see this table now?
Yes, I can.
And everybody else, if I don't hear from you, you are in agreement with Christopher, right? All right, so yes. I've got to do this again. This was our initial position, and more money is put into the agricultural sector. 80% of the expenditure will be on agriculture and only 20% on a sterile class. And so can you see that now? We've got 2,400 here. And our surplus is 2,400. And our total expenditure on the two classes is still 4,000. Are we all on the same page this time?
Yes.
And now we're talking about the same page, literally speaking, right? Okay, and so if the landlords now have received rent of 2,400, they can go back to an expenditure of 50-50, 50 to the agricultural sector and 50% to the sterile class. And we have an equilibrium where the initial expenditure of 2,400 is equal to the rent which they earn in the form of, well, that's really the surplus or the produit net. And that's when Christopher raised the question, well, now we've got a new expenditure on the farming and the sterile class of 4,800, and we've effectively got a growth of 800 rands. Are we all good up to that point? But if the landlords continue to spend more in line, that is now with the recommendations of the physiocrats, if they keep on spending more in the farming sector and only 20% as per example for the sterile class, then we see that we've got a further growth here from 2,400 now to 2,880 or 2,879, which means that the new surplus earned, the new rent that goes to the landlords is now 2,879. And even if the distribution were to be 50-50, we'd now have a a new equilibrium where the economy now is producing, or the total expenditure on a sterile class and a farming class is 5,757. So from an initial 4,000, it's changed to 5,057. And of course you can see this would continue, right? In fact, you could do the same thing. We could go back to the initial position of 2000, and I'll say, well, what if we were to get rid of, and that of course is really part of the thinking of the physiocrats, at least some of them, some of the more radical reformers, and later we will see certainly part of the thinking of David Ricardo, who was not a great fan of the landlord class, even though he himself became extremely rich and a landlord. And certainly it is some of the consequences that Karl Marx liked about this particular model. If we were now to say we can do away entirely with the landlords, and if we do away entirely with the landlords, and instead of the 2,000 Rand going to the landlords, that 2,000 Rand is really all owned by the agricultural class. And they are the only ones that determine how that surplus, remember, we're looking at the surplus, how the surplus is to be spent. And we can see that, well, if this were to be, okay, if the landlords were to get 0, and this entire rent that was paid to the landlords, or the surplus, were now to be given to the farming class, the agricultural class, well, we would have this growth in the surplus. In the initial period, we'd still have a total income of 4,000, but if that surplus is reinvested, okay, we got this surplus, if it's reinvested 100% in, or okay, if the farmers are getting that entire surplus and they are spending it as per our assumptions, then we're getting an ever increasing surplus, where this will now be 3,554, and the economy will grow from 4,000 to 7,106 Rand. Do you follow all of that? And so the table really has got some very radical consequences, namely that the landlords and the social setup at the time is a handbrake on economic development. If one were to get rid of the landed nobility, and if you like, the aristocracy and the like, which is of course to a degree, and of course not fully, what did happen at the French Revolution, then that might have beneficial consequences for the economy, because the landlords are just a handbrake on economic development. It doesn't mean that the sterile class will remain impoverished, because you can see that initially the expenditure was 2,000 on the sterile class, the income would have been 2,000, and now it is 2,369. So they will eventually, not immediately, but over a few periods, begin to benefit from, if you like, the elimination of the landed class. In fact, I mentioned that last week. Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, writing the General Theory in 1936, he had something like that in mind when he talked about the rentier class. Okay, let me put it there. He talked about the rentier class. Those are the people that are they're living from rent only. They're not really doing anything, and so they're not really making a contribution, but they do earn their income. Let me just put that there. That was Keynes who talked about the rentier class. And of course, what we will see later when we talk about rent, when we look at Ricardo, and in modern economics, when we talk about rent seeking, we've got sort of this indication that rent tends to be something that is a brake on economic development. It is unearned income, and it's just allowing a particular class or group of people to earn income for which they have not created. We'll see discussions along those lines, of course, also to degree with Marx in economics. All right, so that a bit of a just filling in some of the gaps relating to the physiocrats. I will now remove this. Right, any questions regarding to that or the physiocrats? Yes, Mpumelelo.
Yes, Doctor. I wanted to ask, with regards to the zigzag model that you've just shown us, what would be the market for the farmers? Because if we give 100% to the agricultural sector, then what is the market for the farmers? Because the assumption is that the economy is closed. So the only market, in my understanding, is the sterile class, in that the agricultural sector gives half to its own sector, to its own class, and half of it to the sterile class. And then how can the sterile class purchase if they have no income?
Okay. So you just got to qualify your statements. It's not that they have no income, but the income will only come from the expenditures of the farming class. Remember, the farmers, they are also buying implements from we would have the line going across like this. The farmers are also buying implements from the artisans and from the manufacturing sector. But yes, in our initial period, we see that as a result of the absence of the landlords, if you like, and no expenditure by the landlords onto the cereal class, they've only got the income or the expenditure of the farming class. Can you see, did I pull that up correctly? Can you see that table again?
Yes, Doc.
You can see that the zeros there means these are all the lost revenue from the landlord class. And what they depend on now is only the expenditure that's made by the agricultural sector on the output of the artisans. But that output by the artisans by the agricultural sector is higher. Is it higher? Let's just go back.
So then, am I correct in assuming that the model begins with the assumption that there is capital stock for the sterile class, in that there is something that the sterile class can sell at the beginning of the time period of the model?
That's absolutely right. Yeah, that's one of the assumptions. There's something that they've got to sell to begin with, just as the farmers have got a surplus which they are giving to the landlord. So it's not from a ground zero, but as there would have been previous growth for them to have the implements available to manufacture more goods, and that is really they expenditure. When they receive when the landlords are spending 1,000 rand on a manufacturing sector, the 1,000 rand that they earned, 500 will be spent on the agricultural sector, and the remaining 500 rand will be spent on themselves, and that allows them to maintain or grow their capital equipment. But at the end, the surplus that's produced, I mean, whatever the surplus that gets produced is through the bounty of nature. And so it's like a free good from God, if you like. Now, if we were to go back to, at some point, let's say at some point we had a situation where we did away with the farming sector. Sorry, we did away with the landlords. And we get this result here, and we've got the growth in the surplus. And so on. Okay, you can see that the income earned by the sterile class, the manufacturing class, they were obviously at the beginning, they suffered a lot because expenditure on the agricultural sector diminished from 2,000 to 1,333. But as the economy grows, it will lead to also an increase in the expenditure on the agricultural sector. And so it's a bit like today, people talk about a trickle-down effect. And so, the image is that we should, if there's investment initially in one sector, that will lead to growth in that sector, but the additional income earned in that sector will eventually trickle down to all the sectors. And that is what is being illustrated here. Until at some point, even though they've lost that income or that expenditure made from the landlords, in total, they're now better off because the income or expenditure on their output is equal at this point to 2,369. Does that answer your question, Mpumelelo? Now, one thing I want to point out is the following. Look at how rapidly this is growing. After just 4 periods, suddenly the surplus is 6,316. And expenditure on a sterile class and farming class has jumped to 9,474. Is that in any way realistic?
No, it's not.
And of course, we're not trying to say that the model itself wants to be realistic. It is a model, and they wouldn't have wanted it to be realistic. But it would certainly show that there's something very important missing in this model, because it would be too easy to really get to a doubling of the economy within a short period if you just put all your money into the farming sector. Okay, so it's saying more and more is being invested into the farming sector. There will be growth, but that growth seems to be enormous. There's something important that's missing from this analysis, which is one of the most central elements of sort of our production thinking at the moment. What is missing in this model? It is something that will be introduced about 50 years later. Not that it wasn't thought of by others or even by the physiocrats, but it is something that then became the center of economic analysis at the time, or through the work of David Ricardo. Any guesses as to what is missing from this model to avoid such a gloriously optimistic situation?
Isn't it the limitations of land?
It is the limitations of land, that is right. I'm looking for a slightly different and more technical term for that limitation of land.
Diminishing marginal returns.
There we go. It's the law of diminishing marginal returns. The more you invest into, if you've got a piece of land, and and that was what Ricardo was all about. If you have a given piece of land and you put more and more effort into this land, then well, you can put more and more fertilizer and output will increase, but it will increase at a diminishing rate. The extra output will be positive, but it will be diminishing. And so that's the law of diminishing returns. Now, David Ricardo expressed it differently. We'll talk about that next week or the week after. Namely, even if you bring under agriculture different pieces of land, the additional pieces of land that are being brought under agriculture, well, they will add to output, but what they add to output will continue to be less and less, for the simple reason that the most productive pieces of land are being employed first, and the less productive pieces of land are employed in subsequent periods. And so their contribution in subsequent periods will be less than the most productive pieces of land are generating. And so that will be the limits that are being posed on this very positive view that we have from the tableau économique. And that's one thing that we'll realize as we now move to Adam Smith, and as we go from Adam Smith to David Ricardo. With the work of Adam Smith, there's a lot of optimism and confidence that the world is, or that there will be economic growth. And later, with the introduction of the law of diminishing returns, that optimism gets dispelled to some extent. All right, so let's conclude this now on the physiocrats. Any questions? Any other questions that you have? Okay, so we move on to Adam Smith. And in particular, okay, let's do that. This is, can you see the type, this document here, the theory of moral sentiments? Is that on your screens?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So that was the book that made Adam Smith famous in the first place. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And then, of course, later we have this other book. Can you see that? The Wealth of Nations. You can't. Okay.
No.
So it looks like every time I want to show something new on the screen, I've got to go back to you guys and call it up. The Wealth of Nations. Okay. That will be, so we'll be looking at those two aspects. If we talk about Adam Smith, what I've prepared, and I think I've put that onto your items on the readings for Adam Smith. Can you see this? This is like a mind map and it's complicated. Can you see anything there? And at the center, we've got the wealth of nations. All right, that's Adam Smith, the wealth of nations. Is that visible to you?
Not really.
Not really, okay.
No.
It doesn't matter, as long as you can see do you see that there's a lot there?
Yes.
Okay, so there's a lot there. So of course, we're never going to do justice to Adam Smith because there's just so much to be said. And of course, you've made a start on that. You are preparing or some of you have, you've given me answers on the question on Adam Smith that dealt with what did it deal with? It dealt with Adam Smith and help me along. You just did that.
It was the precursors of Adam Smith.
The precursors of Adam Smith. All right. And so we'll get back to that in a moment. Now, in terms of assignments, I haven't yet marked those essays on the precursors of Adam Smith. And I haven't yet loaded the results of your after lecture quiz of last week. So certainly, and from some, I've had feedback from some who are struggling with the amount of material and writing, and to a degree, I can see that also when it comes to, let me just pull this up. When it comes to our channel, sorry, that's the wrong channel. That's not what I wanted to show you. Oh, this is complicated to deal with this technology, forgive me. But when it comes to our video channel, and okay, so I loaded, is that what it looks for you as well, our Witshet video channel? And there is my lecture, which I loaded. We're gonna have to talk about David Hume, who was a friend of Adam Smith. But nothing new has been loaded, and people are struggling somewhat with keeping up to date with the work, and so am I. So that's why I haven't yet given you returned. I haven't yet marked what you submitted on Monday. And anyway, I like to usually do the marking on the weekend. So for this week, there's going to be no assignment. Is there any feedback to that? Jubilations?
I'm glad that of there being no assignment this week. I also found the assignment that we just did a bit challenging because of the fact that I had to know what Adam Smith asserted in his Wealth of Nations, as well as know the contributions of the precursors to the work of Adam Smith. So I found it a bit challenging myself.
Okay, thank you very much. Was that Mpumelelo who was talking here? Can you see me all again? Because
yes, sir.
Okay, because my screen, doesn't look so healthy anymore. I've got all sorts that are up. Just give me a moment because my screen is very confused now. I don't have the Witshet meeting in front, so I don't even know who's there. I can see only half of the screen, and I can see Sichle's hand up, and I'll come back to you in Mpumelelo. But first, how do I get my full screen back so that I see everybody? I don't know how that works. Hold on. Okay. So I'll get back to what you're saying in a moment, Mpumelelo. Sichle, you've got something to say.
Hi, Professor. How are you?
Very good. Nice to hear your voice. I thought it's only Mpumelelo and I talking. So Liesel was there as well, and Christopher, and who else? But thanks for joining us.
No, I just wanted to find out. You did put some questions on Adam Smith, the dogmatic and pragmatic viewpoints, and
Yes.
Mr. Meyer's writings on Adam Smith.
Yes.
So that we don't have to hand it on Monday anymore.
No, sorry. That is still for Monday. I'm talking about after that.
Oh, okay.
Or what? Okay. I mean, what we can, that's still for Monday. So I'm sorry that I'm confusing you here. I'm giving you, after this assignment, you'll get a break after that.
Oh, okay. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sichle. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to clarify that. Any other points, comments? Well, then let me get back to what Mpumelelo was saying. Quite right. That would have been a lot more challenging, not because it's longer than what you've done before, but because it is now based, it's like, okay, I mean, you're asking a question about a question, so to say. I'm asking you about who were the precursors of Adam Smith, and how can you evaluate that if you don't even know what Adam Smith said? So you trying to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, and that of course is very difficult. And the same applies to the question on Mittermeier, doesn't it? Because and that was on the WhatsApp group. It's like, okay, you're asking us, what does he say about the state of economic theory? Where is that? Where do I find that? And so what I'm doing now, I'm trying to see how you're able to cope with that, sort of trying to get to master material without really having been taught about it. It's for me to get a feel of your work, where you're at, given that the individual assignment only counts 1% to your year-end mark. You will see that in terms of the overall weight, it's not going to affect your mark much, but it's giving me a lot of information about the students and the capabilities of the students. And that, of course, for me is important, because when that's going to affect, I mean, to a degree, a take-home exam always to a degree involves more than just what was being taught, or I think it ought to. And so that's giving me a bit of information about you, the students, and your capabilities of doing independent work. And at the same time, it's giving you the practice and the exercise of doing that. But it's not easy, okay? It's not easy. It's difficult, especially if it's entirely new work. So I appreciate your comment, Mpumelelo. Does that answer your question? Well, I'll get back to you, Mpumelelo. Christopher, your hand is raised.
Yes, I just wanted to say I've been working through the incredibly condensed version of The Wealth of Nations, which was uploaded on Sakai, and I've really found that to be a very helpful resource, because it's so accessible to read, and yeah, it's very easygoing. So I found that to be very, very helpful.
All right, thank you very much for those comments. Sichle. No, Sichle, I think you don't want to say anything. Okay, so on the whole, since Christopher, broach that subject, you know, the material that I'm putting onto Sakai. Do you have any comments to make about that?
I share the same sentiment as Chris, because I also went through the condensed version of The Wealth of Nations, and I found it easier to read as opposed to the other material that was posted.
All right, great. I mean, what you can do, you know, I put material on Sakai, and I'm given that we only meet once a week, you know, I really don't know what you're doing as individual students. I don't know what resources that you are using. What you can do, if right now, this time I was lucky, I put something up there which you found easy to work through. Maybe at other times I failed to put something up that is useful for you. So you can just send a message and say, you know, have you got anything that would help us along those lines? And then I'll try and put something up like this. Thank you for that feedback. And you're welcome to make any comments on the readings, you know, either in class or on the WhatsApp group. But remember, I mean, you know, you're honest students, you're doing a lot more than we're just doing in class. And so I'm happy to see that you're making use of what I put up there, and just tell me to put more up if you want more to be up there. Right, so Adam Smith. So I'm pleased to hear that Christopher and at least Christopher and Mpumelelo had used that condensed version of The Wealth of Nations. And of course, we need to get to The Wealth of Nations most importantly. And what does The Wealth of Nations start with? What's the title? What is the first chapter? What's the title of the first chapter?
Isn't it something about the division of labor?
On the division of labor.
Yeah.
I mean, can you imagine a more boring title? You know, you open The Wealth of Nations and you expect something exciting and grand, and you get something that deals, you know, the division of labor. Well, at least that was my feeling when I first encountered Adam Smith. But it, you know, we'll see when we come to The Wealth of Nations, we of course got to realize that it plays a crucial role. So, but before I get to The Wealth of Nations, I just want to say a few words on Adam Smith. Again, I'm not going to say a few words on the life of Adam Smith. There are beautiful anecdotes, and there are hundreds of those. And if we go, let me just take you to that. I'm going to share content with you, and on Sakai. Oh, I'm scared that I'm not going to find Sakai. But there's a book by Strathern. I forgot the Paul Strathern in the general texts that I've loaded, and you know, he's got a lively account of the life of Adam Smith. So I can certainly recommend that. Go and read Strathern on Adam Smith. Then you get a feeling of the man, who he was. We'll get a bit of a feeling of the man as we go along. But by all accounts, he was a very absent-minded person, very involved with his thinking and his thoughts. He would an anecdote in Strathern, for instance, is Adam Smith. He gets up in the morning and lost in thought. He gets out of his house. He's walking to some destination. He's still in his pajamas, and he doesn't look where he's walking because his head is up like that. And he walks into a ditch, and doesn't even realize that he's walked into a ditch and walks out on the other side. You know, that's the sort of person apparently that Adam Smith was. Or he's making tea and lost in thought, he's taking the tea bag and putting it into the cup. And the cup, well, it's full of water, but the water is cold. So it wouldn't have been a very enjoyable tea, I suppose. That's Adam Smith. And he lived with his mother until the mother passed away at the age of 90 or so. But certainly, by all accounts, a very pleasant person. Unfortunately, today we think of Adam Smith. You know, often we associated Adam Smith with sort of hardcore, dogmatic, laissez-faire, free market, and you know, I was some years ago. Quite a while ago, I went to a conference of people that, you know, a group called the Pèlerin Society, and they were all great admirers of the work of Adam Smith, and they were, you know, talking about the invisible hand and laissez-faire, but they were all very successful business people, and I remember especially the contingent from Cuba. You know, those were the people that were basically chased out by Fidel Castro, Fidel Castro. They made it big in Cuba before then, and they were big in the US at the time. But you know, they were very strident and very harsh, giving capitalism and free markets and laissez-faire and the like a bad name. But it's not a bad name that's attributable to Adam Smith, certainly not. And certainly the illustration I've given to you of you know, him as a person wouldn't convey that. When he wrote the book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, it was in the 1750s. He was a professor of philosophy and morality, I forgot, at Edinburgh, and he was loved by his students. He was very popular, and by all accounts, he was a very, very likable person, was Adam Smith. And his theory of moral sentiments, wow, you know, why a book? You know, let's put the book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, into contexts. So you may recall last week or the week before when we talked about Hobbes and Locke, and they're looking at, you know, how is an economy, a society, let's talk about society as a whole, not just the economy. How is it able to function if the influence of the church is diminishing, as it has diminished by that time already radically? As in a period of enlightenment, well, what do? We are the products of the Enlightenment period. We think we can think for ourselves. We don't have to take direction from the church. We think we ought to think for ourselves and do what we think is right, and we shouldn't take direction from the government at every corner. And so with that sort of questioning, how is it possible? Okay, Hobbes gave us one answer. He said, let there be a Leviathan. And if you like, you could say a communist society is one where direction is given by the all-powerful state. But what in the absence of the Leviathan, what of the absence of an all-powerful state? How can society function effectively? And so the theory of moral sentiments is an answer to that to some extent. And Adam Smith talks about something called beneficence. He talks about empathy, that we human beings, we have a lot of empathy for others, not just for our family members, but also for other people that we meet occasionally for our friends, for our relatives, for our co-workers, and sometimes even for strangers. We've got a lot of empathy. And with that empathy comes beneficence. And so we are acting, we act having in mind this empathy and this feeling for other people. And in other words, very often when you see movies, you watch movies, everything is a bit vicious when you're looking at business, that people are there out stabbing each other and stealing from each other, and which surely happens, but certainly the view of society that Adam Smith had wasn't really like that. He thought that there's we might call it a human capital in the form of empathy that we have for each other. And that curtails, if you like, what we do to each other and how we behave with regard to each other. And we've got this goodwill for our human beings. And so the theory of moral sentiment deals with that, and therefore is an answer as to how it is that a society is able to function, even in the absence of us being told and educated by church how we ought to behave, even in the absence of the king or another all-powerful state that might have been proposed by Hobbes. Even in the absence of that, you can have a society that functions. And that is the role that this Adam Smith theory of moral sentiments plays, and how you would have to approach it. If you want to, there is, there's been a revival in interest in the theory of moral sentiments in the readings that I've given you for this next assignment, which is the book by Karl Mittermeier on the hand behind invisible hands. One of the introductory chapters was written by, I'm just testing if any of you have already looked at the book. Give me, sorry, I think not at the beginning, but towards the end. There's a book by Rod O'Donnell. There's a chapter by Rod O'Donnell and a chapter by Dan Klein. Now, Dan Klein in particular, let me pull that up on the screen. Okay, I've got here Dan Klein, Theory of Moral Sentiments. It gives you, can you see that on the screen?
No.
Okay, failed again. What you have on the screen at the moment? Can you see me on the screen?
Yes, we
Okay.
can see you.
So let me try that again. Let me pull that up again. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. Okay, I think I know what I'm doing wrong. Here we go. Can you see that now?
Yes.
Okay, so there you've got Dan Klein on the theory of moral sentiments, episode 2. Well, obviously there's episode 1, 2, 3, 4. And each of these episodes are like an hour in length. But if you do this, he's at George Mason University, and also in Sweden. He's got an appointment at the Ratio Institute. And so you've got here the Ratio seminar, Dan Klein on Adam Smith. If you follow my cursor, he says focusing on the theory of moral sentiments. And so if you want more on the theory of moral sentiments, I would recommend that you go and look there at what Dan Klein presents. Dan Klein is sort of one of the leading lights at the moment when it comes to classical liberalism, and he thinks it's that aspect of Adam Smith, the theory of moral sentiments, is a very important aspect for us to understand liberalism, classical liberalism. You know, we'll get to talk about that in our discussion on Adam Smith. And so let me get back to. All right, so I'm back on screen. Am I right? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So the theory of moral sentiments, I've explained the role that it plays. We don't need to spend too much time on it, except what we may want to briefly look at is what he says in relation to Bernard de Mandeville. Did you, okay, I just want to quiz you. Any of you yet read or heard about Bernard de Mandeville?
Yes,
He
we
wrote
have.
Bees, very like scandalous and
Okay, very scandalous. Thank you very much. The Fable of the Bees. Was it posted on the Witshet channel? Was it posted on our video channel? Because I haven't seen it. I think it's only going to come up. I mean, the point is, you know, not much has been posted on this week on the channel. I'll get back to de Mandeville in a moment. Just something on the channel. Of course, if some of you fail to put up what I've asked you to put up, it's not going to lead to your death sentence. But it just means that you're just not going to get the marks for that. Okay. And so you will forfeit that mark. So I hope that, you know, if you're due to put something up, you'll put it up in time. And of course, we, as I said last time, it's something that all of us will want to see and read, because it's the content that I want you to take away from this course. So I've heard three people talk at the same time, and I'm more or less gathered what was said, namely that he wrote the thing called On the Theory of, the Fable of the Bees, and that it was very scandalous. Can somebody just, you know, since any of you know a little bit about the Fable of the Bees, had a chance to read up, or maybe it is there as a YouTube video, I'm not sure. Anybody willing to say something about the Fable of the Bees?
it's about how consumption of luxury goods is important to keep the economy going. But it's a more demand side mechanic than.
Well, let me just go back to your first. The audio wasn't so good. The first sentence you said, it's not required. What is not required to keep the economy going?
Consumption of luxury goods by the elite.
Okay, all right, yeah. So imagine this: the Fable of the Bees. That basically, this what he does. He illustrates this. He says there's a beehive, and all the bees do what they have to do, and things just function. And there are different versions of what he says. So I might be mixing them up, but basically he's saying that, well, what about situations if somebody, and it's a parallel to the economy, if somebody comes along and says that, well, you know what, I really care about other people, and I'm gonna, you know, I'm such a good person, and we all just gotta care about each other all the time, and whatever I'm doing, well, you know, I'm not looking after my own interests. I'm just doing, you know, I'm a good person. I'm a goody shoes person. That I'm going to be doing good for the common goods. And he says, well, that is a recipe for economic failure, because at the end of the day, that person who says he's there to do good for society at large, he cannot be trusted. He's just pretending to be doing good for society at large. At the end of the day, he's just looking after his own interest, but putting it in a more acceptable manner. And a modern analogy of that would be, you know, we could think of politicians. Politicians are saying, no, man, you know, if I'm getting into politics not for my own good, I'm getting into politics for the good of society at large. And of course, anybody, and as the saying goes, politicians have to be distrusted in the first place. And so he talks about this in terms of virtue. You know, people who are claimed to be virtuous are unlikely to be really virtuous. They're just concerned about their own interest. And you can see to a degree how that is now contradicting what Adam Smith says in the theory of moral sentiments. And in fact, Adam Smith takes issue with de Mandeville in his theory of moral sentiments, and I'll explain in a moment why that is of particular interest for you students. So, can you see my screen, which is now the theory of moral sentiments, page 159? You can all see that, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so Adam Smith writes there is, however, another system that seems to remove entirely the distinction between vice and virtue, so that its tendency is wholly pernicious. I mean the system of Mandeville, presented in his book, The Fable of the Bees, or private vices, public benefits. So let's just talk about that. Private vices, he's saying that what people talk about as being a vice really is not a vice. People pursuing their own interest is not a vice. It's a good thing for them to do. And that's why I think it was Chesney who said that it was scandalous at the time, because he's saying that people really, they should pursue their own interests. What is called the private vice really is not a private vice. Again, quite the opposite. Those who are claiming to be virtuous, those are the ones who are vicious, and as an adjective of vice, and those who are pursuing their own interests and might be referred to as people who've got vices, and a self-interest and focus on themselves, are actually the good people that create the public benefits. And so you know, that title tells us a lot, and you can see why he might have been, at the time, he would have been considered, you know, a scandalous person. What does that remind us of today in our society? What would be our position when we hear a theory propounded like that of de Mandeville? Any sort of comments on that? If that is de Mandeville talking then, and he was considered scandalous, what would our view of it be today? Is that like a scandalous statement, Christopher?
I'll answer that question first. I don't think it would be a particularly scandalous statement. I'd suppose that many contemporary economists would probably agree quite readily with that.
Thank you.
But what I did want to say was that position expressed in the theory of moral sentiments, at least in traditional interpretations of Adam Smith, seems almost totally in contradiction with what he then says later in The Wealth of Nations.
And thank you very much for raising that, because that really is then what gets known as the Adam Smith problem, which was that's the way it was put by the German political economists. They were saying, how does that make any sense? I mean, let's look at Adam Smith talking in the moral sentiments. And then later we have Adam Smith in talking about people pursuing their own self-interests. And in pursuing their own self-interests, they are really through, if you like, we'll get to talk about this in terms of the invisible hand, then as if by an invisible hand, it leads to a beneficial economic output. And so the German economists were wondering, how does that get reconciled, this initial view of Adam Smith expressed in the theory of the moral sentiments, and then apparently something different expressed in the Wealth of Nations. Let me just write that down for you so that okay, that's how it's entered. Can you see that, what I've put up there? Oh, yeah. Das Adam Smith Problem. Okay, the Adam Smith problem, that apparent contradiction. And I think we're going to have a presentation on that later, one on the video clips on I think that's one of the topics, the Adam Smith problem. And that's because it does appear to be a contradiction. And you know, that always tends to be a favorite type of exam question, at least for postgraduate students. You know, is there that contradiction? Explain that contradiction. Can it be resolved? Can it be reconciled? Or was there a change in view? Did Adam Smith change his mind? And possibly it's a matter for both. But I'm pleased that you raised that here, because certainly that seems to be in contradiction to what we gather later about Adam Smith. Let me just get back to that point and elaborate.
Sorry, may I add something on this?
Please.
Just that I think that when Mandeville wrote, he spoke about illegal activities, sinful behaviors, as the thing that helps a society flourish. Whereas I think Adam Smith was just a bit more watered down, but it's still self-interest.
Thank you very much. And what you're really doing, you are presenting Adam Smith's argument, because Adam Smith said that, let's raise him up there. My screen is very confusing. There's too much up there. Where do I have? Okay, can you see that? What Adam Smith is saying is that you are removing the distinction between vice and virtue. That it's as if, and you were giving nice example. Who was that now? Was that Liesel, or who talked now a moment ago? Just repeat what you were saying about sinful behavior.
It's Amanda.
Amanda.
Yes, just that Mandeville was saying that sinful behavior and illegal things, illegal activities contribute to the entire society.
Okay. All right. Okay. I guess we should get back to the text of the Mandeville in some more detail. But what is important, what is of interest for us, in particular in this course, is that here we've got these two expressions, vice and virtue. And do we as economists talk about vice or virtue today?
No, we do not.
We do not, hardly ever. You know, what we talk about is rational action. What we talk about, an action in economics, a rational being as we all assume to be. We're all acting to maximize our utility, what have you. And you've just got a whole range of actions. And it's not for us economists to now classify some actions as being a vice and other actions as being a virtue. And so for us, you know, if you were to take, and later we get to look at the work of, when we look at Pareto and the like, you know, those are just what type of questions. I mean, Hobbes would refer to these sort of questions as what? Metaphysical. Remember what Hobbes said about good and bad? Hobbes said about good and bad something to the effect that, well, good and bad is just that which you like or which you do not like. And the same with virtue, you know. I mean, whatever you're doing, you yourself, you're probably gonna call it virtuous, and somebody else may not like it and might call it a vice. And so it's really subjective. Then Hobbes, more importantly, Hobbes talked about truth. Truth is what, according to Hobbes's definition? So to jog your brains here, to remind you, he said that, well, truth is only about the right use of. You're still all there? Truth is all just a matter of the right use of words. And the words that we're having, well, you know, they are created by us anyway. They are by convention. And so for Hobbes, this entire thing about vice and virtue would be a meaningless discussion, because all we have are really just the individual acts. And that's what we do in economics today. We just look at the individual acts. We presume that they maximize the utility of whoever is engaging in those acts. And we don't bother to now look at whether an action is virtuous or is really a vice. And so that classification is not of interest to us as economists today. And so we can see that Bernard de Mandeville is very close to modern economics. And I like the comments therefore by Christopher and Amanda, that, and others who chimed in there, that for economics today, we wouldn't say, that we wouldn't see this as scandalous at all. It's standard fare for economics. So at the time of Adam Smith, what is that now, 250 years ago, Adam Smith took exception to, if you like, the thinking and the work of de Mandeville, but de Mandeville's position today is pretty standard. So to a degree, I'm talking about this because that's going to be useful for your discussion for this essay that you're submitting Monday. Because I'm not sure if some of you have picked up on that in your preparations for the essay and readings for the essay. Anybody picked up what people are saying, what economists are saying about de Mandeville, those who do talk about it? Do they mention him as a precursor to Adam Smith?
Yes, they do. Wouldn't it be the division of labor, what we were talking about earlier, and the bees?
Not so much. Okay, they do talk about him. Cesare, you want to say something?
I was just going to say that rephrasing, or taking the idea of vice as being good and rephrasing it in a morally neutral way, is actually a very important step up in terms of gaining political legitimacy for the idea. That although it's fundamentally the same idea, it's very important. Also, I think that it is different because I think that for Adam Smith, when he was talking about the public good, it was genuinely everybody was involved if the economy was growing. All workers benefited. Everybody benefited. For de Mandeville, because he's still mercantilist, he kind of believes there needs to be a lot of poor people for the economy to do well. So it's much easier to see vice as being something which is actually harming people. Whereas for Smith, private interest can't harm people.
Well, I mean, when we get to Adam Smith, and that's of course an important task, is that what does Adam Smith actually say about private interests? For instance, he uses in The Wealth of Nations, he uses the expression self-interest once, okay, only once, but he talks about self-love, and many will say, well, there really isn't any distinction between self-love and self-interest, although probably, and some have made the argument that there is the distinction. But let's just hear from Christopher what Christopher wanted to say.
From what I understand, often the link between Mandeville and Smith is drawn around this idea of unintended consequences. So a number of dispersed actors who just do their own thing, really, when all taken together, have an unintended consequence of forming something else which they never cognitively intended to do so in the first place.
Roy?
Hi. I think the connection between Mandeville and Adam Smith comes with the invisible hand. I think I agree with Christopher. The unintended consequences create some sort of invisible hand that actually works behind closed doors.
Thank you, both of you. And so when you, especially with a school that's called the Austrian School of Economics, and when you talk to them, I've talked to some, when they talk about when a discussion comes to Adam Smith, they're saying, but it wasn't really Adam Smith the first, the beginning of our central, let's call it philosophy. It really was de Mandeville. That de Mandeville is the man who first created this idea of the unintended consequences and the invisible hand. That this very idea of the invisible hand that's gonna, where people pursuing their own self-interests, it will have those consequences which they didn't care about. They didn't care about society. They were just caring about their own interest. But by caring about their own interest, we have the beneficial effects where the economy as a whole is by an invisible hand led to economic growth. So more and more, and certainly over the past 20 years or so, de Mandeville has shifted into focus when it comes to these sort of questions, and a novelty of which was attributed initially to Adam Smith. They're saying that, well, certainly de Mandeville is the precursor to that. And I'll add to that in a moment, but in the meantime, we've got Jezri having his hand up.
I still think that Adam Smith's conception of what made a nation wealthy versus de Mandeville's makes them very different statements.
Well, I mean, in a sense,
exclusive wealth.
I didn't get that last part.
Whereas Adam Smith had inclusive wealth that included everybody, de Mandeville had very exclusive wealth that was based primarily on a wealthy elite and a very poor working class.
Okay, I mean,
different things fundamentally.
You're surely right. Okay, that the context was different, and what certainly when we look at Adam Smith, we look at that, and we'll have to look at that inclusivity of growth and wealth. And Jezri is saying, well, we really, de Mandeville was a product of the mercantilist period, And Adam Smith is stepping beyond that mercantilist period. But interesting is that the approach, and so Chesri is saying that we've got a Adam Smith being more modern than de Mandeville, because Adam Smith now, of course, will reject the mercantilism in which de Mandeville was still steeped. But when it comes to, you know, theorizing about these things, it's as if de Mandeville is more modern than Adam Smith. If we just pull up again and that's why, in a sense, why de Mandeville is liked by I mean, you know, sometimes I'm just amazed how people, some Austrian economists, for instance, have become very dismissive of Adam Smith, saying that, well, we don't need to look to Adam Smith. We can look further back. We can look to de Mandeville for our beginnings, and it's got to do to a large extent with what he gives us a more modern feeling to a degree for this sort of thing, that for Adam Smith, he cared about vice and virtue. Remember, Christopher, you know, pointed that out. How does that fit with what Adam Smith says in The Wealth of Nations? Now, of course, when you look at something like this, Adam Smith is saying it's an important distinction. His entire book is about that distinction. I mean, if you read what Adam Smith says here about the elimination of that distinction between vice and virtue, he calls it's pernicious. It is, you know, when they are described and exaggerated by Mandeville's lively and humorous, though coarse and rustic eloquence, they give this doctrine an air of truth and probability that is apt to impose on the unskilled. And so you can see how Adam Smith disliked that very much. And it really goes all back to what he's saying is he's just eliminating the distinction between vice and virtue. And yet that is a distinction that is important to Adam Smith. We can look at that again by looking at our initial view at nominalism and realism. If you were to consider if the position of Adam Smith or the position of de Mandeville is nominalist, or realist, which of the two is more likely to be the realist in terms of the classical realism? In, you know, classical realism about, you know, that the general terms that we have are representative of something that is real. Which of the two would be the realists?
I would say Adam Smith.
Adam Smith seems to be the realists, and certainly de Mandeville is now carrying or developing or you know, he's in a tradition of Hobbes, of William Petty, saying that, well, you know, all of these distinctions do not really matter greatly. And that's why we've got, let's play with words, so there's this empathy of modern economists with de Mandeville, because from a theoretical perspective, he's, you know, it's a distinction that is clearly important to Adam Smith, but it's not a distinction that is important, or that, you know, as he says, you know, he's just, de Mandeville is just trying to eliminate that distinction. And so But what I want you, to take from this, and certainly when I hope that I will see some of that in the essays, is that more and more the Mandeville is seen as an important precursor to Adam Smith. Last time we talked about Locke, and to a degree what Locke was saying was also an elaboration, if you like, of what de Mandeville was saying, and already leading into, no, not last week, the week before last week, leading into Smith's idea of the invisible hands. And so what you can see, there's a lot that can be debated here, but we just got to move on, okay? And these we're leaving some things in the air. But these are the sort of things that can be delved in more deeply when it comes, for instance, to issues that might be dealt with in terms of take-home exams or work that may appear later. If we now get to what Chesri was talking about, inclusive growth and the like, and our discussion on the wealth of nations will now also be in the context of what Christopher made us aware of, that there seems to be this incongruence between what Adam Smith says in The Wealth of Nations and what he says in A Theory of Moral Sentiments. Let's look at briefly, let's start looking at Adam Smith here. Can you see what it says there, division of labor? We've noticed that the division of labor is really the starting point of Adam Smith's the Wealth of Nations, and of course the division of labor is an important thing. He gives the example of the pin factory, and if one individual wants to make a pin on his own, he'll take a full day, and what can he do? He can maybe make 20 pins, and he's gone to a pin factory, and the making of a pin has been broken down into 8 or 9 individual steps: cutting of the pin, sharpening of the pin point, the putting on the top of the pin, the smoothing it, the polishing it, and on and on. And he says at the pin factory, thousands and thousands of pins can be produced in one day. Whereas if one person were to do it himself, only a fraction, 1% of that could be made. And that's true. I'm sure all of you would have experienced that in things that you are doing. That it's amazing, by division of labor, by specializing, by doing only one task, so much more can be done. Of course, much later, Karl Marx will point that out as well and say that, well, look at the consequences. You've got workers that work in a shoe factory, for instance. They may never see the end product. They may only deal with the sole, or somebody may only attach the sole, and so there's this alienation of the work because you're not dealing with the final product. But certainly, and Adam Smith wasn't ignorant, but he looks. And we appreciate that this division of labor, as did Marx, as being very important for progress. I mean, nowadays, the people who are making the cars, some of them will never drive a car because they can't afford to have a car, and yet they're making the car, but they're just making one component in a car or installing one component. So we've got, with Adam Smith, we've got the beginning of, let's call it a virtuous circle that starts with the division of labor. The division of labor leads to, can you read, what does it say there next to division of labor? Can you read that?
Is it increased productivity?
Increased productivity. Okay, so obviously we have a lot more, if we, through division of labor, we become a lot more productive. And that gives you an inkling what's coming in this virtuous circle, because at the end of the day, when we talk about an economy doing well, we talk about the economy being productive. So I'm in a sense giving you a summary of the wealth of nations as a virtuous circle. Increased productivity leads to the next step that we've got here. What does it say? Can you read that? Is it my writing that's bad?
Greater output.
Greater output. Okay, it's banal, right? But at the end of the day, that's what the pin factory wants. It wants a greater output. It wants the people to be more productive. How do you get them to be more productive? You get them to be more productive by making them specialize and have division of labor. And what is the benefit of greater output? Can you read the next point in our virtuous circle? Who was reading so nicely? Amanda.
It's higher wages.
Higher wages. Okay, so you can see from the greater output, we're going to have higher wages. And that's what Chesry is talking about. For Adam Smith, his concern with growth was a concern with an inclusive growth. So it's not just that the factory owners, the merchants, the kings are benefiting. No, it's about, at the end of the day, we've got to look at the wealth of a nation. So we got to address the question of a wealth of a nation, just to take a break from the virtuous circle. What according to the mercantilists is the wealth of a nation?
Bullion.
It's bullion. It's bullion. And so the little that you know about Adam Smith already is that for Adam Smith, the wealth of the nation, he was arguing against the mercantilists. And if you argue against the mercantilists, and the mercantilists say that the wealth of a nation, he didn't choose that title by accident. It's directed to a large degree against the mercantilists. If you want to have a wealth of a nation, you cannot rely, you got to look at something other than bullion. Right? And he will also argue against the physiocrats, but we already know that he was an admirer of the physiocratic system, and what we've done today, this morning, you could have seen, an hour ago, you could have seen that just looking at the physiocratic system, by investing into production, into output, into agricultural production, you get a growth in the economy. Not only in the agricultural sector, but you will have a trickle-down effect where even the artisans, the sterile class, will benefit from it. So we've got this beginning of a more inclusive growth that we already see in the physiocrats. So certainly also the physiocrats are precursors to Adam Smith, because it's now a system entirely different from the ideas of the mercantilists. And so the mercantilist said it's bullion. Adam Smith says it is something entirely different. And he agrees, as in my phrasing of just now, agrees with the physiocrats. But of course, he will also argue that, well, production isn't only that which is coming, the surplus isn't just created in the agricultural sector, it's created in other sectors as well. And so we've got this this high wages effect that's taking place. And so, but the high wages effect is not only felt in terms of the people making the pins in the pin factory in the form of high wages, but it's got its effect throughout the economy. And again, Amanda, since you are the designated reader, what does the next step say?
something per capita income increased per capita income.
Thanks. I mean, my handwriting is very bad. Okay, so increased per capita income. All right, so looking at it now from not only an individual firm or factory, but looking at it now from an economy-wide perspective, we see throughout the economy an increase in the per capita income. But of course, you know, our income isn't just for its own sake. All right, you don't want do you want income for its own sake? For what sake do you want a high income?
To buy things that you like.
To buy things that you like. Okay, and therefore, can you read this, Amanda?
Higher.
Yeah, okay. I should rewrite it, but I've got the circle there, so I want to leave it as a circle.
Higher level of something.
Annual.
Consumption. Annual consumption.
Higher level annual consumption. What Christopher was saying, you want to income to buy the things you like. You want to have a high level of annual consumption. So that virtuous circle that we're talking about is leading to a higher level of annual consumption. And then what does he say next? Okay, all right. So now, I mean, now we're all happy. We're all having a high level of annual consumption. We're all buying more things that we like. I like the way that Christopher puts it. If we are able to buy more of the things that we like, how do we feel about ourselves? Do we feel impoverished? Do we feel poor?
We feel good, but it depends on how much credit you take.
Sorry, is that Liesl talking?
Yes, yes.
The line is very bad. Say that again.
You feel good when you buy stuff, depending on how much credit you spend.
Oh, okay. Yeah, depending on how much you're spending, that's right. But you're feeling good, okay. So there's a trade-off. You've got to pay for it, but at least you're able to consume it, and you can do it. And who can do things? The more what you have, the more you can do. The more what you have, the more you can buy. The more you consume.
The more resources, the more money?
The more resources, right, okay. And of course, also the more money, and that's where the mercantilists got stuck, the more money you have. But something else, that in the title of Adam Smith's book,
the more wealth?
The more wealth, the more wealth. Okay, so we've got to understand that in mercantilism, the money that you have is, if you like, that which allows you to buy things, and it's like the cause for you to purchase. But what Adam Smith is looking at, he's looking at the effect. All of this has got an effect, namely that we have a greater, and I want you to read this here, if you can read that, Amanda.
It's a greater wealth of a nation.
It's a greater wealth of nation. It's a greater wealth of, you're not starting with your pile of money like the mercantilists do. And that is really that which allows you to buy. He's looking at this and saying that, well, we've got a higher annual consumption, and isn't that what makes us feel wealthy? You don't have to, you're able to consume more, and that is what is giving you the greater wealth of nation. That is what we feel wealthy, the more we can consume. I mean, this is what wealth is, what is meant by wealth, that it is really allowing us to have a higher, what he called it before that, higher level of annual consumption. Now that's going to lead to one more. That's going to lead to another point here. The more wealthy a nation is, now we can look at the effects of the wealth. Okay, every cause has got an effect, and every effect has got a cause. But greater wealth of nation is really the effect of high annual consumption. But what it allows us to do is it allows us to do something else. Can you read that, Amanda? Do I even show it completely?
No, I can't see it. I don't think you're showing it.
Okay, I'm showing the wrong one. This one here, I think.
Nope.
Oh, okay, that's really bad. Increase in capital accumulation. I'm not even sure if it's there. Okay.
Yeah.
Increase in capital accumulation. And so capital accumulation. Okay, capital accumulation. We haven't talked about that yet. Because in order for you to produce things like pins, you need capital, you need equipment, you need investment. And if we've got, because now we've got this greater wealth of a nation, this greater wealth of a nation allows us now to use some of that wealth to invest in capital. I mean, you look at South Africa. We've got, we've got mines. And there are lots of mines that haven't been really mined to any extent, and they, and there's a problem because there's a, you might have heard about this, that many of the investors into the mining sector, Australian, Canadian, Brazilian investors, American, they're quite happy to go to Mozambique and invest in Mozambique. And other places like Ghana in Africa, but they're very concerned about investing in South Africa. It's an issue because you want investment to take place. It's capital investment. It costs billions to start a mine, but you need that investment for the industrialization, for the economic growth to proceed. So we'll close our virtuous circle. It's also the case that as we increase more in capital, as we make that investment in capital goods, as we have an increase in capital investment, buying equipment, and South Africa always depended on capital investments, I mean, engineering sector, the mining sector, and of course all economies depend on that. But from now, just looking at Adam Smith, what implication that has for our virtuous circle is this year. What does increased capital investment lead to? Can you read that, Amanda?
It's division of labor.
We're back to the division of labor. The more you buy equipment, machinery, the more specialized the people become that operate the equipment or machinery, the more there can be a division of labor. You look at, I mean, that's the purpose of Adam Smith's example of the pin factory. But you look around, you look at any productive sector. I mean, it's gone to such an extent that you look at the manufacturing of cigarettes. And we know that there's only one smoker in this class, right? Who is that? Who is our smoker? Okay, we don't. Okay, all right. Did I say that? To make cigarettes, they've just got those machines. You press a button and you make millions of cigarettes a day. And whatever, you look around, and the name of the game is equipment, machinery. You look at the production of printing. In the past, printing was done by setting letters, and it was very labor intensive. But bit by bit, technology improved, investment into capital occurred, and now you get printing machines that can print thousands of labels an hour, and it only takes one operator, maybe one person to change a plate. And whatever product you're thinking of, you will see that to be the case, that capital investment is at the core of economic development. And he says it's at the core. We need capital investment, not for its own sake, but we need it because that allows us to have further division of labor, further specialization. And that specialization continues this circle, this virtuous circle of economic growth. Now, to a degree, it's something we've already seen amongst the physiocrats, because when the landowner puts money into or makes expenditure on the agricultural sector, well, this is what leads to the surplus. This is what leads to the growth. And so we've got that model in place, if you like, already with Adam Smith, and that is why one of the reasons why Adam Smith had a lot of respect for the work of the physiocrats. But the physiocrats said that, well, this only occurs in the agricultural sector, whereas Adam Smith now says, okay, we can take that virtuous circle. Can you see the circulation that we had in the work of the physiocrats? So we've got Adam Smith's virtuous circle, where the division of labor leads to further increase in investment into capital equipment, and that leads to additional division of labor and so forth. So we got circles at operation in both cases. What Adam Smith, of course, says is that it's not only the agricultural sector, it is other sectors as well. But he's not saying it's all the sectors. He distinguishes between productive and unproductive labor. Okay, for the physiocrats, the only labor that was really productive of a surplus of growth was the agricultural sector. For Adam Smith, he says there are some sectors that are really not productive, and that he actually makes that distinction between productive labor and unproductive labor. And unproductive labor are those sectors or that labor employed in sectors that do not form part. Okay, this is supposed to be the circle from the division of labor all around to higher wages, greater wealth of a nation, increased capital accumulation, and further division of labor. Whatever is not feeding into this system here, therefore for him is unproductive labor. Give me examples of what would not feed into this system here, and would therefore be not productive labor. I'm just checking if you're still there. How's that?
Isn't it anyone in the services sector?
Anyone in the services sector. Because now if the work that you are doing is okay, Cesare, you want to add to that?
I mean, care work is a massive sector not included.
Care worker. Yes. Effectively. Care workers, most service sectors therefore are excluded. And care workers would be amongst those. They are, if you like the sterile class. We're not saying that they're worthless. We're just saying that they're not productive of a surplus that will lead to growth. We're not saying, Adam Smith isn't saying that the care workers shouldn't be remunerated. No, they're making a contribution, but it's not a contribution that feeds into producing of a surplus. Cesare, you want to add on to that?
No, sorry.
Okay, all right, but that's a good example, care workers. And then, of course, the target of Adam Smith were especially people who are employed in doing doing things like doing things for the nobility, for his aristocracy, the butlers. Somebody is a butler, or somebody that does the let's say the helping I don't know much about nobility, but you see those movies about Versailles. I can't watch them where you've got ladies that are waiting on other ladies, the ladies in waiting on the nobility. According to Adam Smith, of course, he would be saying that is unproductive labor. They really, you can't talk about division. You can't even talk about division of labor really, because only one person can comb the hair of a noble lady at a time. I don't know much about this, but that's the sort of image that he had, and I'm sure that is the correct image as regards of what people actually are doing. But as regards how we feel about it today, it's not the case. We wouldn't distinguish between. I mean, you get an idea what for him is unproductive labor. It's unproductive labor is that labor that doesn't feed into the system of division of labor. And work that can be subject to division of labor is productive. And that which is subject to the division of labor is, of course, that which is subject to an increase in capital. And so he's got, even though he didn't agree with the distinction or the division of the physiocrats between productive and unproductive labor, sterile and the agricultural sector, he's got his own notion of what is productive and unproductive. And the criteria for that, it's not that the criteria for that does it feed into this system and this circle of the virtuous circle of growing the wealth of a nation. If it doesn't, for him, it is unproductive. In a sense, you can say that the notion of unproductive labor is a hangover from which is taken from the physiocrats' discussion of the sterile class. Today, what do we say about the service sector? Would we still say the service sector is unproductive, that a care worker is unproductive, that a butler or lady in waiting is unproductive? What would we say today?
Well, in face of the epidemic, you say that they're the only ones that's essential.
Well, yes. Look at this today. We've turned it on its head. We say these are, certainly some of the care workers, the people who care for our patients, COVID patients. They are the essential services. Well, I mean, they're essential, but of course, you mean essential in a different way. To keep the company going, many of the services are actually at the core of it. Like certainly the financial services sector, but certainly the care workers. But we didn't look at the hairdressers as essential, right? I still got to go for a haircut. I haven't been for a haircut because of this lockdown. Mpumelelo.
In defense of Adam Smith, can't we then say that in terms of growth, the service-based sector is not necessarily productive for growth, in that they funnel the services-based economy is a means to which is a funnel for consumption, but in and of itself, it doesn't result in growth. For instance, you can see in the small countries that you've mentioned that are tax havens, they are service-based economies, but they don't grow in and of themselves, but they're just countries to which they don't grow in the traditional sense of what is meant by growth of an economy.
That's right. Yeah, I mean it's because we've just got a much more inclusive, and that brings us back to the terminology introduced by Cesri, much more inclusive understanding of what it means to be productive. And yes, you take tourism as well. Much of tourism is a service, provision of service, and I mean, yes, in defense of Adam Smith, we're not wanting to attack Adam Smith and say he was entirely wrong. What we are doing, we're actually showing that he had a particular, it's not just that he randomly said that these are unproductive and we've got productive and unproductive, but it fits into his model, okay? But we've got, I just want to get back to that. What would we, today we say that the services sector is productive, like the examples you used in those islands, the financial sectors in the Bermudas, in Mauritius, in the Isle of Wight, even Switzerland, made lots of money on the financial services sector. But what is let's look at it like this. Before I do that, let me just get back to Roy. Roy, you've got something to add there?
Yes. So in terms of how much a sector contributes to growth and what Adam Smith is saying, I have a question actually. So my question is, what about the taxation of those sectors? Does that not contribute to growth? And although I'm not sure about the regulations of taxing on healthcare and schools, but if they do pay tax, will they not indirectly or directly contribute to growth of the economy?
Well, that's certainly what we would all be saying today. We would agree. If you were to say that's the case, we would agree to you. And we could look at who's the biggest employer in South Africa?
The government.
The government. The government
Yes.
is the biggest employer, and the government accounts for something like 30% of GDP. Okay, and certainly, they're supposed to be doing work, right? And I suppose government employees do work and make a contribution. The point that we're trying to get at is that we're using a different criteria from Adam Smith as to what it means to be productive. For Adam Smith, for it to mean productive is to a degree like that of the physiocrats, okay? That it's got to be adding to the physiocrats who are saying a surplus. Yes, Christopher?
I just wanted to read a line very quickly from this condensed version of The Wealth of Nations. And the author says here, on this topic of productive and unproductive labor, he says, Smith is breaking new ground. So the fact that he struggles to pin down these concepts is understandable. I just thought that was an interesting take on this discussion of Smith's notion.
All right, he's breaking new ground because he moves beyond the physiocrats, and he's providing us. And many people say, well, what did Adam Smith contribute that was really new? This is quite, it doesn't look like much, but this is really giving us a way to think about the economy, where we can see that we can see that we're putting labor in the contexts. We're putting labor and our physical ability, human labor, not the agriculture, as the source of a surplus, but we're putting our labor as the source of the surplus. And so that's, of course, how we see ourselves, isn't it? And that's what's breaking new ground. That's what we see ourselves. I mean, you guys, you're studying at the moment. I'm not sure how productive you see yourself, but maybe not now. But when you start working, you want to be productive for your employer. You want to be productive for your employer. It may be service, whatever, but you are productive by virtue of your labor. It may not be physical labor. It's going to be gray matter labor, but you're going to see yourself as productive. And so we if you look now at the difference from the mercantilists who didn't have this recognition of labor and our ability, our human capital, to feed into economic growth and wealth, and then the physiocrats who now started to realize, hey, it's something else at work here. It's the surplus we've got to be looking at, and the surplus comes from the agricultural sector. Adam Smith is now generalizing that. He's generalizing that, and he's saying that, Okay, there we've got our human contribution. That division of labor, that's at the heart of this. Except the things that didn't fit into this, and thank you for that line, Christopher, the things that didn't fit into this, he still referred to as unproductive, okay? And who can blame him? Because very often you see very unproductive work. That's, you know, if you give meaning to the distinction between productive and unproductive. But that brings us to the question, is there such a distinction between productive and unproductive? Remember, Adam Smith tried to maintain a distinction between vice and virtue. And then he tried to maintain a distinction between productive and unproductive. And then we were saying about vice and virtue as economists, we say we don't care about this. All we got are actions, you know, rational decision making and individual action. We don't need to be able to talk about vice and virtue. According to Hobbes, it doesn't exist anyway. You know, it doesn't exist. Vice isn't, these are just words. Smith is now still trying to maintain a distinction between productive and unproductive. But what we've generalized Adam Smith further, haven't we? We no longer use his virtuous circle as a criteria for productive. What do we take as a criteria for what is productive or unproductive? For what is our criteria for saying somebody, you know, if you're going to take a job, what is our criteria? How do we know that? How do we know if I look at all your names here and I see some people have left, so we've got to finish off in a moment. Yes, Chuck.
The measure to measure productivity would be output.
Okay, and how do we measure? Okay, how do you measure output?
By comparison to previous output or future output.
Okay, well, you know, that's physical goods, all right? But very often it's not, physical goods are not available. Roy?
I would say maybe Adam Smith was right, but you can measure productivity by looking at surplus.
Okay. That's of course what the Marxists then will say. Okay, so we can see that at some point you can now go in two directions. You can continue focusing on the surplus and say there is a real thing called a surplus, and that is certainly the way that the Marxists go, and therefore your answer, if you take the Marxist position, you'd be saying this is how you now measure productivity, and you know it's in terms of the surplus. But since most of the, you know, and that's and we'll get to that, but the modern economist who's a non-Marxist would take another position. What would that be? Who was first, Mpumelelo or Roy? Mpumelelo.
I would say they're measured in terms of income or money.
Thank you. It's money. Is somebody willing to pay for it? Okay, let us say I'm looking at, you know, on my screen on the bottom right, I've got Atupele, and she's working for me. And if I say she's not productive, and I want to dismiss her, then she's not going to get money. Okay, and I say, well, she's not getting money because she's not productive. But if I'm paying her, if I'm raising her salary from 50,000 to 100,000 Rand a month, well, I'm doing that because I find her particularly productive. And so the willingness to pay is our modern criteria for what it means to be productive. Roy?
I have a question about productivity, and this might be unrelated to the topic. I'm sorry if I do take the class away, but is the informal sector productive, although it makes income? Is it productive to economic growth? Well,
absolutely. Absolutely. And certainly if our criteria for productivity and productive labor and production is willingness to pay, then the formal sector is productive. Sorry, the informal sector is productive. Give me an example of an informal sector activity. Anyone, there's zillions.
Well,
the street vendors. Oh, sorry, Roy.
Street
it's okay,
vendors
you can-
they are earning a living, aren't they? Okay, they're not selling at cost. They buy at 5 Rand and they sell at 7 Rand. And the difference between the two is the income that they're earning. So that measure of income that they're earning is the measured productivity in terms of our criteria for what is productive, because that will turn out to be their salary or salary equivalent, their wage. It's their return. It's their return. It's the people are willing to pay them 7 Rand for the service to get what is sold on a street corner right there and then, even though they could go somewhere else and buy it at 5 Rand themselves. They're providing a service, but somebody's willing to pay for that service. And so our criteria for productivity and productive labor is willingness to pay. And so we can you see the tradition, how we're moving away from mercantilists to the physiocrats to Adam Smith to where we are at the moment. It's a continuum, okay? And certainly I like the quotation that Christopher gave about, I don't know how that contributor continues writing about Adam Smith grappling with the division between productive and unproductive labor. But I might just say that for Adam Smith as a realist, the division between productive and unproductive labor would have been as important as is the division that he drew between virtue and vice. Because it might be important to us as well that we can look at activities which are considered productive today, given our criteria of what it means to be productive. But we may look at this and say, well, that's not productive at all. I mean, can you think of examples where people are earning a living, but we don't really believe that they're productive? Yes,
politicians.
Well, just, I don't want to say these things, but give examples. Why politicians?
Well, the thing is that a lot of people believe that government is too big. So there is a belief that there is unnecessary individuals that are in government. So therefore, they are being paid for unproductive work.
Yeah, I mean, half the government budget goes to salaries. In Zimbabwe, 75% or 80% of the government budget goes to salaries. The higher the budget of the proportion of budget that goes to salaries, the less productive the people who are employed in government actually are. And the same you will find in Switzerland. Only about 25% of the government wage bill goes to, only 25% of the budget goes to the wage bill. Christopher.
Okay, Dr. Stetler, I'm not sure if you would know what this is, but I'm sure a lot of our colleagues do. It's a recent phenomenon called OnlyFans.
I don't know what that is, no.
Basically, it's a form of sex work, but it takes place on a social media platform.
Okay. Well, is that productive? Anybody tell me, is that productive?
So going back to
Somebody's
Mandeville,
earning salary.
he
People
Thank you
pay
very
for
much,
it, it's
Christopher.
productive.
Thank you very much. Okay, that's an example. Who was next? Cesri.
Mandeville was actually quite supportive of sex work and wrote a whole essay on why he thought it occupied an important place in society.
Thank you. I mean, can you see again? Can you see how one we see from this example how scandalous Mandeville was, but today that's no longer scandalous. I mean, it seems to be something official from what I hear from Christopher. And so again, Mandeville's, it's productive. You'd be saying, yeah, that's contributing something important. But okay, but let's try more difficult to find examples. Okay, we've heard politicians that are getting paid, and by our criteria of what it means to be productive, they are productive, even though we often don't think so. Liesel? Yes, Liesel?
Sorry, I wasn't muted. I would say that if you put stuff on a website and you write it and it's your work and you don't get paid for it, but the website asks money for it, then your work is unproductive for you.
Yes, but they're getting money for it, right?
Yeah, but you are doing unproductive labor because you don't get money for it.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, because your line is very bad, I don't hear everything that you're saying, but just using that criteria, because you don't get paid for it, you are not considered, really, you're not producing. And the people who get the money for it are the one who are productive. Those who put the website together and are now getting the money for it. They are
yes.
therefore. But now, take how do Guptas, are they wealthy?
Very.
Very wealthy. Would we consider them to be, I mean, would you consider them to have been productive? Jacques?
Quite the opposite.
They were destructive. They were destructive. Quite the opposite. They were destructive. Correct. I mean, that's how we talk about it. Okay. Even economists would see them as being destructive. But if we employ the criteria of being paid, earning money for what you're doing, which they were doing a handful, then our criteria for what is productive and what is unproductive probably is too large. It's too permissive. It's too inclusive. It's overshot the inclusiveness that Cesare talked about earlier. I still got Jacques' hand up.
So maybe I'm overthinking it, but I'm curious, especially with regards to pay for productivity, especially like the Guptas or politicians. What if the consumer does not willingly pay these so-called productive outputs? Like indirectly, we paid for the Guptas, but we really didn't want to. Whereas if I pay for gardening services, it's something that I want and that renders them productive.
Yeah, you're not overthinking it. You're thinking the right direction. The problem is, for an economic analysis, we in making these decisions, willingness. It's difficult to see willingness. You got to be speculating, okay? Because at the end of the day, all you see are the effects. Somebody is paying. We would certainly, from an Austrian perspective, would want to talk about willingness, but from a scientific, from looking only at the effects, you wouldn't know what. I mean, there are some people who willingly pay tax, and some who are not. So it's difficult. We would like to use that as a criteria in order to do better economics. We would like to use that willingness or unwillingness to be a criteria for that. Because you willingly pay your gardener service, as you say, but you don't willingly pay tax. But some people do willingly pay tax, and then very often. So idea of doing something willing is very useful for us to understand what's going on. Okay. And so it would be something we would want to develop our economic thinking on. Do we willingly do it or not do it? And that is, of course, where you now got a division, if you like, amongst later economists, where for the Austrian economist, that willingness, what goes on in your mind, is very important. But then you get other economists who say that we cannot deal with what's going on in the mind. That's not for us to do. That is for the psychologist or whatever to analyze. Mpumelelo, then I'll get back to you, Shak.
I think further elaborate on what Jot is saying. I don't have this thing pinned down fundamentally, but my thinking on it is we can divide it between the pragmatic and the dogmatic perspective, in that in regards to the willingness from a dogmatic perspective, is that because there is a market for it, then therefore you're willing to give the Guptas money in as it relates to your taxes and so forth, because it exists. But from a pragmatic perspective, is that it is the perversion of the market to tend towards things that are not natural, or they don't resemble the intrinsic value of what a certain good or service presents.
Fantastic. Okay, so you got it in there for that upcoming assignment, because that at the end of the day is what it will boil down to. Because if we adopt okay, we talk about free markets, we're talking about laissez-faire. Can I read that? What's there? Okay, so okay, on that high note, okay, now you're all thinking, right? Thank you very much, Mpumelelo. That is a brilliant point. That is what it will come down to. Do we adopt a pragmatic approach to the markets and to production, or do we adopt a dogmatic? Because a dogmatic approach would be saying we cannot impute, we can only go by the effects, we can only take on a laissez-faire approach, and the other approach would be we gotta tread cautiously. We gotta be able to distinguish between things like willingness or unwillingness. We cannot simply take our criteria to be the A-all and the B-all of matters. And how actually we take the criteria is an indication of whether we're pragmatic or dogmatic. And so Jacques and Mpumelelo, you sort of on the same line of thinking. Yes, Jacques, you still want to add more?
Oh, sorry, I didn't lower my hand.
Okay. All right. So that was.
I would like to add more, if I can.
Pardon? Yes.
I think regarding dogmatic and pragmatic, I think we should definitely take a little bit more of a pragmatic state. Even Smith himself was not as dogmatic as we always believe regarding free markets. He was quite pro institutions. As example, he proposed taxes, government, education systems, stuff like that.
Indeed. I mean, it certainly looks like that Adam Smith was more on the pragmatic side. What it will also, and so that was the one question that was raised on the WhatsApp. What about the state of economic theory? Because the state, Mittermeier's thinking, thinking about the state of economic theory has to do with that, where we take a criteria, let us say like willingness to pay, and we divorce that willingness to pay from, if you like, from our mental state. Sorry, where the will correct, because you may not be willing at all to pay for it, but you're forced to pay for it. And so you get to situations that Adam Smith kept on lamenting. Adam Smith kept on lamenting about the monopolies, about the guilds that were earning monopoly profits. And it's not, and you know, that's for him, that was also unproductive. That was also predatory or plunder. And it is, and so what you can see what people actually do. These are the effects. And if you're only looking at the effects, then okay, you don't see where there's willingness. Then you're removing the pragmatic element of it, where you're only looking at effects. And to the degree that much of economics is treated as very quantitative, it is only looking at the effects. And so we sort of the state of economic affairs to a degree is a confusion, because we're taking models to be a description of what is the reality, what is actually the case. So what Mittermeier says about and we haven't exhausted Adam Smith at all yet. We'll talk more about Adam Smith next week. There's so much more to talk about, namely the natural price and the market price and so much more. But what Mittermeier says is the following. He says that Adam Smith has got this idea of a market economy, and it's an economy that's based on free markets. And he takes a pragmatic approach to it, namely that, well, it's got to be instituted. Now, but what do we want to, that which we want to institute, by definition, cannot yet be in existence, can it? Okay, if he's making an argument for free markets, well, then clearly it's not yet in place. Otherwise, there'd be no need for him to make the argument to have free markets. Okay, so it's not the case that Adam Smith took this idea of economic growth and free markets and laissez-faire. It's not that he took it as a description, because if he were to take it as a description, then there would be no need for him to argue in favor of it. And much of what he does is arguing in favor for free markets and for changing institutions. And we look at some of the examples next week. And so for Adam Smith, what he was talking about to a degree was an ideal rather than a description. And the argument that Mittermeier makes is that in subsequent periods where we are adopting the view that we're taking now as economists, is that what we should do, we shouldn't talk about ideals. We shouldn't talk about what should be the case. What we do as scientists, what do we do as scientists? As scientists, we make positive statements. We say what is the case, not what ought to be the case. Don't you get that taught in all your subjects, economics 1 and sociology and psychology and psychiatry and political studies? You're often told you got to be a scientist, and as a scientist, your duty is to say what is the case, not what ought to be the case. And because we find ourselves in this particular bind where we see ourselves as scientists, we want to make statements about what is the case. Adam Smith didn't have that problem. He didn't see himself as a scientist. He was pragmatic. He saw that there are elements of a free market in existence in the UK at the time. There are these elements available around, and to the degree that those elements are around, the economy of England was doing well, better than the French, with all its regulation. It had some free markets. He gives examples, for instance, in the university field. He says that if he went to study at, for a while, he went to Cambridge or Oxford. He hated it. He said the lectures were useless. Whereas in Scotland, the lecturers are good, because you know why? Because in Scotland, you could choose who to go to, and you paid the lecturer, the professor yourself directly. That's how the professor earned his income, by students paying for his services. But in the UK, it's like at Wits University and most universities in the world today. You are forced to go to a certain lecturer. He doesn't have to do well in terms of lecturing. He gets paid anyway because he gets paid by the university. He doesn't get paid by the students. And so the willingness criteria falls out of the picture. So he says that if there were a free market for lecturing and giving lectures, it would lead to one outcome, like in Scotland, and people actually find the educational system a good system. Whereas where you have the situation where students or where the lecturers don't have to perform well, you get a very different outcome. So what Adam Smith says is that there are elements of the free market which exist. And to the degree that they exist, it's leading to good economic outcome. But they are still not pervasive enough to achieve an even better economic outcome. And in order to achieve that even better economic outcome, he's putting forward that ideal of the free markets. It can only be an ideal because it's not an accurate description of it. But and Mittermeier says the confusion is that we don't want to deal in ideals as scientists. We want to deal in facts, okay, in positive statements. And so later that will be with variations in meaning that becomes a form of positivism. I'm not sure if you've heard about positivism, but the duty of the positivist scientist is to provide a description and therefore, to the degree that economics has become positivist, certainly at the time of Pareto, and we look at that later, what the beginnings of what Adam Smith was saying about an ideal now gets appropriated and is no longer seen as an ideal, but is now seen as a description. So today you will have Chicago economists who say that even, it's not a description. The free market may not be a perfect description, but we can fudge it by saying that it behaves as if there were free markets in operation. I mean, you look at the very monopolized economy these days in America and elsewhere, they're clearly not free markets. They cannot be free markets if you only have one or two corporations that control it. And so instead of then like the pragmatist Adam Smith saying that, well, let's try and do something about this and let's try and create a free market environment, the dogmatist would be saying, descriptively, it may not be accurate, okay, but the outcome is still such that as if it were a free market. So we can really deal with the ideal as if it were a description, at least the description of the outcome. And so what Mittermeier is saying is that it's a confusion. It's a confusion. Okay? Does that help for your essay? Mpumelelo.
Okay, I wanted to understand if maybe I'm on the right track in understanding what you're saying with regards to Carl Mittermeier's assertion in regards to the state of the economy. Is that he had a pragmatic approach rather than a dogmatic approach, and he saw the plunder and predatory aspects in the market. And the economy as a discipline looks at a quantitative perspective. So therefore, it does not look at what ought to be, but it just looks at what is. And Adam Smith asserted that there should be free markets, and that free markets are not a given, but that there needs to be institutions that are there in order for the free markets to occur. And then you went on to the positivism, as well as looking at things from a Pareto point of view.
Yeah, that's very good. Just one addition to that. I mean, what you did was comprehensive. We can now step back and look at classical liberalism. You mentioned plunder and production. And it's very difficult for us when we only want to make positive statements, when we're really only looking at the effects in terms of what income people have earned. We really find it difficult to distinguish between plunder and production. So when you take a textbook on economics, it's all about production and production functions and what have you. Plunder or predatory activities do not occur. You will not find, I mean, maybe next week I'll be able to give you some examples, real industry examples of predatory activities that are destructive of value rather than productive. And so an additional component of Mittermeier's argument is that the very purpose of classical liberalism from the time of Adam Smith and before the time of Adam Smith, and really of Adam Smith, was that classical liberalism engaged exactly with this problem of plunder, because we need to look at, if you want an economy that grows and becomes successful, you need to be able to reward only productive activities, not plunder activities. If plunder activities get remunerated and rewarded, then why should anybody bother about production? You just get into plunder. I mean, that's why we've got the law. The law is to stop us from stealing, because that's plunder. That's not going to be good. We only want to reward productive activities. Now, in the context of Adam Smith and the period before Adam Smith and the mercantilism, when you look at the obvious example of plunder, it's pirates on the sea. It is the marauders in the Middle Ages who were stealing, plundering the fields, and the farmers were defenseless. What happened to the farmers? You know, not long ago I watched a movie of Spain in the 1600s. You know, the farmers were so disillusioned because the landlords were just taking everything. And therefore, production wasn't occurring. And what is the consequence? Famine. There was famine. There wasn't food because plunder was rampant. And so the whole problem of classical thinking has been that we need to be sure for Adam Smith, we've got to have institutions in place. We've got to create a system where what is being rewarded are not the destructive activities, but only the productive activities. And so that division between productive and unproductive, between plunder and production, is really, according to Mittermeier, at the very heart of classical economic thinking. And that is the heart, therefore, also of Adam Smith. Adam Smith was concerned about what do we need to do to reward production rather than plunder. And then he looks at all these examples of the British East India Company, and he doesn't see them as productive at all, because they're given a free mandate to go to the easts and operate as monopolies and do as they please, and really they're just enriching themselves rather than they be competition, and the whole of England would benefit from some of those activities. Christopher.
I just wanted to say that I really like Mittermeier's point, because I think it speaks more, somewhat ironically, because he was an economist, to a metaphysical point that kind of begs the question of what is science. We're in the age of scientism now, which purports to be value-free, when in actual fact, in many ways, it's value-laden. And in the same way, economists try and represent themselves as value-free, but they are themselves value-laden. And yeah, I appreciated that analysis of how what is presented as value-free oftentimes is not so, and leaves us in a little bit of a position where we don't really know what we're talking about to begin with.
Right, and that is just an elaboration on what I was saying about there being a confusion. We don't really know what we're talking about, and of course, and part of the problem has to do, and you'll see that when you read more, because because we like to adopt a nominalist view of things, where we like to adopt a nominalist view of things because that helps us certainly, and that's why we're so quantitative. But when we want to talk about it, when we want to make sense, I mean that the nominalism feeds into the value, that you want to be scientific. But when we want to talk sense, we're still talking about those general terms. We cannot get rid of general terms when you're really talking about important matters. All right, when you're really talking about what matters, did the Gupta steal or did they not steal? Were they virtues or was it a vice? Now, science cannot make a judgment on that. And to the degree that we want to be scientific, we step back and we say, for somebody else to say. And so we're not taking responsibility. And the thing about, of course, about Mittermeier is that he's a realist, okay? With these matters, and that's why he's true to Adam Smith. Because just as for Adam Smith, the distinction between vice and virtue was important, and production and unproductive, like the monopolies and like the guilds and because what does Adam Smith say? Adam Smith says that when you get merchants getting together over a pint of beer, the first thing they talk about is what can we do to get the better of our customers, if you like. What can we do to enrich ourselves at the cost of everybody else? They collusion. In economics, we've got that expression, collusion. You've got the cartels, they are colluding. And in the past, when we had a different understanding, there would have been that, in South Africa, we do that still. We don't allow collusion. But in other countries, in America, cartels are very difficult to break up. Because we've lost the idea of what it means to have free markets. And so just as it was important for Adam Smith to distinguish between vice and virtue and between productive and unproductive, so it's important for Mittermeier to emphasize the fact that we've got predatory activities and plunder activities. And that is always a hallmark of adopting a realist position. And so then from that position, he's able to understand and see the confusion that we have in economics, where we don't really know what we're talking about. Are we talking about, is our model a description of the economy, or is it what we say it ought to be like? And even if we have data, we then don't know, is that data now descriptive of a free market economy, or is it descriptive of an economy with a lot of concentration? Because when it comes to economic, we don't treat theory in the way that the realists do, where we've got logical conclusions that flow from it. We always want to be scientific and affirm them with data. I mean, we're now raising huge questions here, and I'm very pleased that there's all that thinking is going on. But I wanted to finish early. Now it's 8 o'clock, just about 8 o'clock. So any last words on your side?
All good from me. Thank you.
Then we meet in a week from now.
All good.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
Thank
bye.
you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.